I'm Anastasia Lincoln, 35, a career officer who worked my way up from a modest start. For years, I covered for my family, money, logistics, emergencies, no questions asked. But on Christmas Eve, when my brother dumped red wine on my uniform and sneered, "Still a deadbeat in uniform," while my father laughed, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you cared for? Tell me in the comments, you're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to draw a hard line to protect your dignity, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. Growing up, my brother and I existed in a constant state of competition wrapped in the thin veneer of sibling loyalty. He was 2 years younger, quick with a smile, and even quicker to find trouble. I was the one who cleaned up his messes, took the blame when necessary, and stood between him and consequences that might have actually taught him something. Our childhood home operated on an unspoken system where his charm bought him immunity, and my sense of responsibility made me the family's unofficial crisis manager. When he broke Mrs. Peterson's window with a baseball, I was the one who showed up at her door with my allowance money and an apology. When he got caught cheating on his algebra test, I spent 3 nights tutoring him for the makeup exam while he played video games in the next room. When he borrowed Dad's car without permission and returned it with a dent, I convinced Dad it had happened in the school parking lot while I was driving. The pattern established itself early and held firm through our teenage years. He would push boundaries, create chaos, or simply fail to meet expectations, and somehow I would find myself smoothing things over. Not because anyone asked me to, but because the alternative, watching him face real consequences, felt like a betrayal of something fundamental between us. When I announced my intention to join the military after high school, the reaction was predictably mixed. Mom worried, Dad expressed cautious pride, and my brother shrugged with the casual dismissal he reserved for things that didn't directly benefit him. He was heading to college on our parents' dime, studying business with the same half-hearted commitment he'd brought to most endeavors. "You sure about this military thing?" he asked one evening as I filled out paperwork at the kitchen table. "Seems like a lot of rules and early mornings for not much payoff." I looked up from the forms, taking in his expression of mild bewilderment. He genuinely couldn't understand why someone would choose structure over comfort, discipline over convenience. To him, my decision represented an unnecessary hardship, like volunteering to carry heavy boxes when others were available to do the lifting. "It's not about payoff," I said. "It's about service." He shrugged again and wandered off to watch television, leaving me with the distinct impression that I'd spoken in a foreign language. The disparity in our choices became more apparent over the following years. While I progressed through basic training, advanced instruction, and my first assignments, he drifted through college with mediocre grades and an ever-expanding social circle. Our parents spoke about his fraternity activities and weekend parties with the same fond indulgence they'd always shown, while my achievements, promotions, commendations, successful deployments earned polite acknowledgement and quick subject changes. The financial dynamic that developed revealed the deeper pattern. During my first deployment, I sent money home regularly. Not because my family was struggling, but because it felt right to contribute, to maintain my connection to them even from thousands of miles away. When I returned on leave, I learned that my brother had been asking for money too, for spring break trips, for a better car, for various schemes that never quite materialized into anything productive. "He's young," Mom would say when I questioned the wisdom of funding his latest adventure. "He needs time to figure things out." But I was young too, just 2 years older, and I'd figured out enough to know that enabling irresponsibility wasn't kindness. Still, I kept sending money home, telling myself it was for my parents' benefit, not his. My brother's relationship with responsibility remained consistently strained. Borrowed money never got repaid. Promises to help with family obligations evaporated when more interesting opportunities arose. When Grandma needed help moving to assisted living, I took emergency leave to coordinate the transition while he claimed prior commitments that couldn't be broken. "You're so much better at this stuff," he'd say with that easy smile. I'd probably just mess it up. It was a convenient excuse wrapped in false humility, and we all pretended to believe it because the alternative required acknowledging some uncomfortable truths about character and commitment. The favoritism wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was constant. Dad would laugh off my brother's latest mishap with the same indulgent shake of the head he'd been using since we were children. When I made mistakes, rare as they were, the response was disappointment and lectures about living up to my potential. My successes were expected, his failures were endearing. "Your brother's got that spark," Dad would say during phone calls. "He'll find his way eventually." My way, apparently, was already found and therefore required no additional commentary or encouragement. The uniformed daughter who showed up for family obligations, helped during crises, and maintained steady contact from wherever the military sent her had become part of the landscape, reliable, predictable, and taken for granted. This dynamic crystallized during a conversation with my sister-in-law, whom my brother had married in a ceremony I'd attended while on a brief leave. She was sweet enough, though increasingly influenced by his perspective on family relationships and responsibilities. "It must be nice having something you're so passionate about," she said during one visit, gesturing toward my uniform hanging in the closet. "Though I worry it keeps you away from really connecting with people." The observation stung because it revealed how completely my brother's narrative had taken hold. My years of showing up, contributing, and maintaining family bonds had been reframed as emotional distance. My commitment to service had become evidence of an inability to prioritize relationships properly. In their version of our family story, I was the rigid, duty-bound sister who chose obligation over intimacy, while he was the warm, spontaneous son who brought joy and lightness to family gatherings. It was a narrative that conveniently excused his absence during difficult times and elevated his presence during pleasant ones. More importantly, it was a narrative that everyone seemed eager to embrace because it made the imbalance in our relationship feel natural rather than chosen. I began to understand that my loyalty, reliability, and sacrifice had become the foundation for their comfort rather than sources of mutual respect and appreciation. The more I gave, the more normal it became to expect such giving. The more I showed up, the more my presence was assumed rather than valued. The more I shouldered responsibility, the more reasonable it seemed for others to avoid it. This realization didn't come with anger or resentment, at least not initially. It arrived with the quiet clarity that sometimes follows long periods of confusion. I finally understood the game I'd been playing without realizing it, and more importantly, I understood that I'd been losing. Years of military service had taught me to recognize unsustainable situations and develop strategies for addressing them. What I hadn't learned, until now, was how to apply those same principles to family relationships that had grown dangerously out of balance. The time was coming when that imbalance would demand correction, though I didn't yet know what form that correction might take. The subtle mockery started small, the way most erosions begin. My brother would refer to my uniform as my costume, when talking to friends, always with a laugh that suggested playful teasing rather than genuine disrespect. He'd tell stories about family gatherings where I was the strict one, editing out the context that made my seriousness necessary, the crisis I'd been managing, the problem I'd been solving, or the responsibility I'd been shouldering while others looked the other way. "She's always been the serious type," he'd say with fond exasperation, as if my reliability was both endearing and slightly excessive. "Everything's got to be done by the book with her." These characterizations stung because they contained just enough truth to seem reasonable while completely missing the point. Yes, I followed protocols and honored commitments. Yes, I took obligations seriously and expected others to do the same. But these weren't character flaws or signs of rigidity. They were the foundation of functional relationships and successful endeavors. His wife, initially respectful during our early interactions, gradually absorbed his perspective and began reflecting it back to me in small, cutting ways. She'd make comments about my work clothes when I arrived in uniform, or joke about my military precision when I organized family activities efficiently. The warmth in her voice cooled over time, replaced by the polite distance reserved for difficult relatives who must be tolerated rather than enjoyed. "You take everything so seriously," she said during one family dinner, laughing as if this were obviously problematic. Not everything has to be a mission, you know. I just finished coordinating care for Dad during his bout with pneumonia, arranging his medications, scheduling follow-up appointments, and ensuring he had groceries and transportation. My brother had expressed concern via text messages and promised to help, then disappeared for a week on a golf trip with college friends. But somehow, I was the one taking things too seriously. Dad's encouragement of this dynamic was perhaps the most painful aspect. He'd chuckle at my brother's jokes about my military obsession and shake his head with mock despair when I demonstrated competence in areas where my brother showed none. When I successfully handled a complex family financial issue that my brother had created through careless spending, Dad's response was to joke that I should consider a career in accounting instead of playing soldier. "Your sister's got everything figured out," he'd tell my brother with a mixture of pride and dismissal. "She's married to that uniform." The implication was clear. My commitment to service was excessive, antisocial, and ultimately less valuable than my brother's more relaxed approach to life. My achievements were acknowledged but framed as symptoms of an unhealthy obsession rather than evidence of character and capability. Family gatherings became exercises in controlled frustration. I'd arrive with gifts, help with preparations, and contribute to conversations, only to watch my brother receive disproportionate attention for simply showing up. His stories were funnier, his opinions more interesting, his presence more valued, not because these things were objectively true, but because everyone had agreed to pretend they were. He'd regale the table with tales of his latest business venture or social adventure while I listened politely, knowing that any attempt to share my own experiences would be met with polite interest followed by swift subject changes back to more relatable topics. Military life, apparently, was too specialized and serious for family conversation, while his casual employment history and recreational activities were endlessly fascinating. The isolation I felt in my own family's home was profound and growing. I was welcome, certainly, but as a supporting character in someone else's story rather than an equal participant in our shared narrative. My role had been defined, the responsible daughter who could be counted on to handle difficulties, while others enjoyed the pleasures of family connection. This role came with expectations and limitations. I was expected to be available during crises, but not to burden others with my own challenges. I was expected to provide financial help when needed, but not to question how that help was used. I was expected to understand when others couldn't meet their commitments, but not to adjust my own reliability accordingly. The growing sense of alienation wasn't entirely conscious at first. It emerged as a vague discomfort during family interactions, a feeling that I was playing by different rules than everyone else without having agreed to such an arrangement. Over time, this discomfort crystallized into awareness that my loyalty was being taken for granted while my brother's casual approach to family obligations was being celebrated. I began to notice how conversations shifted when I entered the room, becoming more polite and less intimate. I observed how my opinions were received with respectful nodding, but rarely influenced actual decisions. I saw how my presence was assumed for family obligations, but my absence was never really missed during purely social gatherings. The realization that I'd become functionally invisible within my own family except when useful was both painful and clarifying. It explained why my contributions felt increasingly hollow and why my visits home left me feeling more distant rather than more connected. Something fundamental had shifted in these relationships, and I was beginning to understand that the shift had been deliberate rather than accidental. My family hadn't simply grown apart from me, they had actively constructed a version of our dynamic that served their needs while marginalizing mine. This understanding would prove crucial in the weeks and months ahead, when the careful balance I'd maintained for so many years would finally collapse under the weight of one moment's casual cruelty. Christmas Eve dinner was supposed to be intimate, just immediate family sharing a quiet meal before the chaos of Christmas morning. I'd arranged my leave carefully to be home for the holiday, driving straight from a ceremony at the base where I'd been recognized for exceptional performance during my latest deployment. The uniform I wore carried the weight of genuine accomplishment and recent honor, but I kept that information to myself as I entered my parents' house with gifts and good intentions. My brother and his wife had arrived earlier in the day, filling the house with their particular brand of animated conversation and casual disorder. He was between jobs again, something about a business opportunity that hadn't panned out, but his mood remained buoyant as always. His wife fluttered around the kitchen, helping Mom with preparations while making pointed comments about how nice it must be to have such flexible work schedules. "Look who finally made it," my brother called as I hung up my coat. "The conquering hero returns." There was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there during our phone conversations, a sharpness that suggested something had shifted in his attitude toward me during my absence. Perhaps it was the contrast between his professional instability and my steady advancement, or maybe he'd simply grown tired of maintaining even the pretense of respectful sibling rivalry. Dinner conversation meandered through safe topics: Mom's garden, Dad's golf game, plans for the following day. I contributed when asked, but mostly listened, content to observe the familiar rhythms of family interaction. My brother dominated the discussion with stories about his latest adventures, each tale growing more elaborate with the telling, while his wife provided appreciative laughter and encouraging comments. The shift came without warning, triggered by something I said about military tradition and the honor of serving during holidays. It was a casual observation, not a lecture or complaint, but my brother's expression darkened immediately. "Oh, here we go," he said, reaching for the wine bottle. "Time for another sermon from Saint Uniform." The words might have been teasing, but his tone was sharp with genuine irritation. He filled his glass and then, without breaking eye contact with me, tipped the bottle toward my jacket. The red wine splashed across my chest and shoulder, soaking through the fabric I'd worn with pride just hours earlier. "Look at you," he said, his voice loud enough to carry through the sudden silence. "Still a deadbeat in uniform." The moment crystallized with perfect, terrible clarity. The wine dripping from my jacket. His face flushed with wine and satisfaction. His wife's sharp intake of breath. Mom's hand flying to cover her mouth. And Dad throwing back his head and laughing, as if this were the most amusing thing he'd witnessed in months. I said nothing. Words felt inadequate to the moment, insufficient to bridge the gap between what had just happened and what should happen next. The wine continued to drip onto Mom's carefully set table while everyone waited for my response, an apology, perhaps, or a defensive explanation. Or maybe tears that would allow them to comfort me and restore the familiar dynamic where my pain became their opportunity for magnanimous forgiveness. Instead, I reached for my napkin and began cleaning wine from my hands with methodical precision. The stain on my uniform would be permanent, but my composure would not be broken by their need to see me diminished. "I think I should go," I said finally, my voice steady and quiet. "Oh, come on," my brother said, already backtracking as he recognized that something had changed. "It was just a joke. You're taking this way too seriously." But I was already standing, already gathering my things with the same careful efficiency I'd learned in military service. Mom was apologizing, Dad was making uncomfortable noises about everyone settling down, and my brother was shifting between defensive justification and nervous attempts at humor. None of it mattered. The line had been crossed, clearly and publicly, with witnesses who chose laughter over justice. The humiliation was complete and intentional, designed to put me in my place and remind everyone of the hierarchy that had always existed in our family relationships. As I walked to my car, I could hear voices rising behind me, arguments, explanations, someone calling my name. But the conversation I needed to have wouldn't be with them, and it wouldn't be tonight. The uniform they'd mocked was still wet with wine as I drove home, but it represented something they couldn't touch with their casual cruelty. That night, I sat in my small apartment and considered the weight of what had happened. Not just the wine or the words, but the laughter that followed. The moment when my father chose to find humor in my humiliation rather than defend his daughter's dignity. The moment when years of taking their disrespect in stride had finally led to this, open mockery delivered with confidence that I would absorb it without consequence. They had miscalculated badly. I made one phone call that night, brief and professional, to a trusted colleague who understood the complexity of family obligations and military duties. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it set in motion a series of events that would fundamentally alter the comfortable assumptions my family had built around my infinite tolerance for their treatment. The wine would wash out eventually, but the memory of their laughter would prove indelible. More importantly, it would prove instructive about the difference between loyalty and servitude, between family love and family exploitation. By morning, they would begin to understand that difference as well. The rest of Christmas Eve passed in my apartment like a held breath. I changed clothes, treating the stained uniform with the respect my family had failed to show, then sat in the growing darkness and thought about years of accumulated slights and dismissals. Not with anger, exactly, but with the cold clarity that comes when illusions finally fall away completely. I'd spent so many years telling myself their behavior was thoughtless rather than intentional, casual rather than calculated. The wine on my uniform had washed away that comfortable fiction. The laughter that followed had made their contempt explicit and public. Most importantly, their confidence that I would simply absorb this latest humiliation had revealed how completely they misunderstood both my character and my capabilities. My phone rang several times, Mom trying to smooth things over, my brother alternating between defensive justifications and half-hearted apologies. I let the calls go to voicemail and listened to each message with growing clarity about the dynamics I'd been enabling for far too long. "You know he didn't mean anything by it," Mom's voice pleaded through the speaker. "He's just going through a rough patch with work. You know how he gets when he's stressed." But I didn't know how he got when stressed, and I also knew how he got when confident, happy, drunk, or disappointed. In every emotional state, his instinct was to elevate himself by diminishing others, and I'd been his favorite target because I'd been his safest one. My loyalty had become his shield, my forgiveness his guarantee of immunity from consequences. That arrangement was about to change. The call I made was brief and professional, placed to a colleague whose competence I respected and whose discretion I trusted completely. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez had served with distinction in multiple theaters and understood the delicate balance between personal considerations and military necessities. "I need a favor," I said without preamble when she answered. "It's personal, but it's also legitimate." "What do you need?" "My brother's been talking about wanting military experience on his resume. He's between jobs right now, early 30s, physically capable. I want to know what options exist for someone in his situation." Sarah was quiet for a moment, understanding immediately that this request carried weight beyond its simple parameters. "Are we talking about encouraging voluntary service or facilitating involuntary service?" "I'm talking about presenting opportunities that match his frequently expressed interests and capabilities." She understood. We'd worked together long enough for her to recognize my careful word choices and their implications. "I'll make some inquiries. Family situations can be complex." Indeed they can. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it represented a fundamental shift in my approach to family relationships. For years, I'd absorbed their treatment passively, telling myself that tolerance was virtue and that family bonds required infinite patience. Tonight had taught me the difference between patience and enabling, between loyalty and self-destruction. I spent the remaining hours until dawn thinking about justice and consequences, about the difference between revenge and accountability. What I was contemplating wasn't motivated by spite or anger, though both emotions were certainly present. It was motivated by recognition that relationships without boundaries inevitably become relationships without respect. My brother had spent years testing those boundaries, pushing against limits that never materialized, escalating his behavior because previous escalations had been forgiven or ignored. Tonight had been the natural culmination of that pattern, public humiliation, delivered with confidence that it would be absorbed without meaningful consequence. He'd made a critical error in calculation. At exactly 0700 hours the next morning, while my family was presumably sleeping off their Christmas Eve festivities, my brother's wife received a certified delivery at their front door. The envelope bore official military markings and required her signature, which she provided with the confused compliance people show when confronted with governmental efficiency. Inside were deployment orders, properly formatted and legally binding, assigning one civilian contractor, my brother, to a support position with an overseas engineering unit. The assignment was for 18 months, with possibility of extension based on performance and mission requirements. The pay was adequate, the benefits standard, and the expectations clearly outlined in military terms that left little room for interpretation or negotiation. At the bottom of the official document, in the space reserved for authorizing signatures, was my name, rank, and current position. Information that would be immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with military hierarchy and administrative procedures. Her hands shook as she read the document, understanding immediately what she was holding and who had arranged for her to receive it. The implications were clear and comprehensive. My brother would report for duty within 72 hours, would be subject to military discipline and scheduling, and would discover firsthand what service actually required from those who chose to accept its obligations. The phone calls began within the hour. First my brother, his voice tight with disbelief and growing panic as he realized the orders were legitimate and legally enforceable. Then Dad, alternating between outrage and desperate attempts at negotiation. Finally Mom, pleading for explanation and hoping for reassurance that this was somehow a misunderstanding. These orders are lawful, I told each caller with professional calm. They stand as written. You can't be serious, my brother said during his third call of the morning. This is crazy. I have a life here, responsibilities. So did I replied. Every time I deployed, every time I missed family events, every time I put service before personal convenience. You seem to find that amusing. That was different. This is your career, your choice. And now it's yours too. The beauty of the situation was its perfect legitimacy. The orders were genuine, processed through proper channels, and based on real staffing needs in overseas support operations. My authorization was valid and appropriately exercised. The assignment matched skills my brother had claimed to possess and interests he'd frequently expressed, at least when those interests served his purposes in conversations. More importantly, the deployment would provide him with 18 months of direct experience with the military life he'd spent years dismissing and mocking. He would learn about early morning formations, equipment maintenance, following orders without question, and maintaining standards under pressure. He would discover what it meant to serve others rather than expecting service from them. Most significantly, he would understand what it felt like to have major life decisions made by someone else, to have comfort and convenience subordinated to duty and necessity, and to live with consequences he hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. The irony was exquisite. The uniform he'd mocked would become his daily requirement, the discipline he'd ridiculed would become his survival skill, and the service he'd dismissed would become his defining experience for the next year and a half. His wife's reaction was perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the entire situation. She'd spent months making subtle comments about my priorities and lifestyle, questioning my commitment to family while enabling her husband's avoidance of responsibility. Now she would experience firsthand what it meant to manage a household alone, to handle emergencies without backup, and to maintain relationships across distance and time zones. You have to fix this, she demanded during one particularly heated phone call. This isn't fair to our family. Fair is an interesting concept, I replied. I wonder if you've considered how fair it's been for me to handle family crises alone while you and my brother enjoyed the benefits of my reliability without offering reciprocal support. The silence that followed suggested she hadn't considered that perspective. External pressure mounted quickly. Extended family members began calling, offering to mediate or negotiate some compromise. Friends of my parents expressed concern about family harmony and suggested I was overreacting to what had been a minor incident. Even my brother's former employers were contacted to provide character references that might support an appeal for exemption or delay. I remained politely unmoved by all interventions. The orders were legal, necessary, and appropriate. My brother had repeatedly expressed interest in military experience and had frequently criticized the ease of military life compared to civilian challenges. This assignment would provide him with first-hand knowledge to inform his future opinions on both subjects. Moreover, the timing was actually quite convenient. He was currently unemployed, had no immediate prospects, and had been discussing his need for career direction. Military service would provide structure, purpose, and valuable experience that would benefit his future endeavors. The logic was unassailable, the process was legitimate, and the outcome would be instructive for everyone involved. By evening, the reality had begun to settle over my family like cold water over a hot surface. My brother would be leaving, whether he wanted to or not, and he would be learning lessons about service and sacrifice that he'd spent years avoiding. The wine stain on my uniform had been cleaned, but the stain on our family relationships would require much more extensive treatment. Treatment that had now begun. The transformation began immediately. My brother, who had never encountered a situation he couldn't charm or sidestep his way out of, discovered that military orders operate according to different rules than family dynamics or civilian employment. There were no negotiations, no extensions, no appeals based on inconvenience or personal preference. Within 72 hours, he was processed through intake procedures that measured him for uniforms, assigned him identification numbers, and subjected him to medical and psychological evaluations he'd never imagined would be required. The same casual attitude that had served him well in previous endeavors was now a liability that attracted unwelcome attention from drill instructors who'd seen his type before and knew exactly how to address it. His first letters home were predictably bitter, filled with complaints about early morning formations, rigid scheduling, and superiors who wouldn't tolerate his usual approaches to responsibility and authority. He blamed me for his situation, naturally, but the blame carried less weight when filtered through descriptions of daily routines that left him exhausted and challenged in ways he'd never experienced. "The food is terrible," he wrote to Mom. "The accommodations are basic, and they expect you to be ready for inspection every morning at 0600. Everything has to be perfect, your bunk, your appearance, your equipment. They don't care if you're tired or if you have other things to worry about." The irony was apparently lost on him, but it wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd been ready for inspection every day of my life, maintaining standards he'd mocked while he enjoyed the luxury of lowered expectations and casual performance. Now he was discovering what those standards actually required and why maintaining them was considered both necessary and honorable. His wife's experience proved equally instructive. Without his physical presence to charm away problems or deflect responsibility onto others, she was forced to handle household management, financial planning, and decision-making independently. The grocery shopping, bill paying, and maintenance issues that had somehow always fallen to others in the past now became her direct responsibility. Her initial calls to me were filled with barely contained resentment and thinly veiled demands for assistance in managing her newly complicated life. She seemed to expect that my intervention in their situation would be followed by my support in handling its consequences, as if I were obligated to clean up the mess I'd created by imposing accountability. "I don't know how to handle the car registration renewal," she complained during one call. "He always took care of that stuff." "The DMV website has clear instructions," I replied. "It's quite manageable if you follow the steps in order." But I've never done it before. Neither had I, the first time. Learning new skills is part of adult life. The conversation ended with her hanging up in frustration, but subsequent calls indicated she was indeed learning to handle tasks she'd previously considered beyond her capabilities. The process was clearly difficult and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also necessary for her development as a fully functional adult. Dad's response to the situation evolved more slowly. His initial outrage gave way to uncomfortable recognition that his son's deployment was legitimate and unavoidable. The jokes about military life became less frequent as weekly phone calls revealed the genuine challenges my brother was facing and the personal growth those challenges were forcing upon him. More significantly, Dad could no longer dismiss my own service as excessive or unnecessary when confronted with evidence of how difficult that service actually was. The casual mockery he'd encouraged now seemed less amusing when directed at someone he could see struggling with military expectations and requirements. "He's having a hard time adjusting," Dad told me during one conversation, his tone uncertain rather than accusatory. "Adjustment is part of the process," I replied. "Most people find military service challenging initially, but the challenge is what makes it valuable." I never realized how structured it would be. Structure is the foundation of military effectiveness. It's also what creates the discipline and reliability that enable service members to handle responsibilities others might find overwhelming. He was quiet for a long moment, perhaps remembering years of comments about my own structured approach to life and responsibility. The discipline he'd once mocked as excessive was now revealing itself as necessary preparation for meaningful challenges. From thousands of miles away, I watched my family's comfortable assumptions about service, sacrifice, and responsibility undergo systematic dismantling. My brother's deployment wasn't punishment, it was education delivered through direct experience rather than theoretical discussion. He was learning what I'd tried to explain for years through words that had been dismissed or ignored. The uniform he'd ridiculed was now his daily requirement. The early mornings he'd joked about were now his reality. The discipline he'd considered unnecessary was now his survival skill. Most importantly, the service he'd minimized was now shaping his character in ways that civilian life never had. The satisfaction I felt wasn't personal vindication, though that element was certainly present. It was the deeper satisfaction that comes from watching justice operate through natural consequences rather than artificial punishment. My brother wasn't suffering because I wanted him to suffer, he was learning because learning was what the situation required. His wife wasn't struggling because I wanted her to struggle, she was growing because growth was what independence demanded. Dad wasn't reconsidering his attitudes because I'd forced him to, he was adapting because reality no longer supported his previous assumptions. The wine stain on my Christmas Eve uniform had been the catalyst for this transformation, but the transformation itself was being driven by truths that had always existed. I'd simply removed the barriers that had prevented those truths from having their natural effect. The process would continue for months, gradually reshaping relationships and assumptions that had been decades in the making. But already, the foundation was shifting in ways that would prove permanent and profound. Months passed. Letters arrived with decreasing frequency, but increasing maturity. My brother's handwriting remained the same, but the content of his communications underwent gradual transformation as military life imposed its lessons through daily repetition and unavoidable consequence. "I understand now why you take things so seriously," he wrote in a letter that arrived 6 months into his deployment. "Everything here depends on everyone doing their part correctly. When someone doesn't follow procedures or skip steps, other people suffer the consequences. It's not like civilian jobs where you can coast or let others pick up your slack." The observation represented significant progress, though he still framed it as a unique characteristic of military life rather than a universal principle of functional relationships and organizations. Understanding would come gradually, if it came at all, but acknowledgement was a promising first step. His wife's evolution proved more dramatic. Forced to handle challenges independently, she discovered capabilities she hadn't known she possessed and developed confidence that had been stunted by years of learned helplessness. Her phone calls to me shifted from complaints about her difficulties to occasional updates about her successes in managing their household and finances alone. "I got a promotion at work," she mentioned during one call, her voice carrying surprised pride. "They said I'd shown initiative in handling some problems that came up while Tom was away." Initiative. The word hung in the air between us, both of us recognizing its significance. She'd spent years believing herself incapable of handling complex situations, but necessity had revealed that belief to be incorrect. Her husband's absence had created space for her competence to emerge and flourish. Dad's adjustment was perhaps the most significant because it was the most reluctant. His worldview had been organized around my brother's charm and potential, with my achievements serving as reliable background support that required neither attention nor acknowledgement. The deployment had disrupted this comfortable arrangement by forcing him to confront the actual demands of military service and the character it required to meet those demands successfully. "Your brother's letters sound different," he admitted during a phone conversation that stretched longer than our usual exchanges. "More thoughtful, I guess." "Military service tends to encourage reflection," I replied. "When your decisions affect other people's safety and mission success, you learn to think before acting. Is that what it was like for you? All those deployments?" The question surprised me with its directness and apparent genuine interest. For the first time in years, Dad seemed to be asking about my experience rather than simply acknowledging its existence before moving on to more comfortable topics. Every deployment taught me something about responsibility, teamwork, and personal limits, I said carefully. The lessons weren't always comfortable, but they were always valuable. I don't think I ever really understood that. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to receive, and I accepted it as such. Understanding, even late in arriving, was preferable to continued willful ignorance. As my brother's deployment stretched into its second year, the letters revealed continuing adaptation and occasional insights that suggested genuine character development. He wrote about helping younger soldiers adjust to military life, about taking responsibility for equipment maintenance, and about the satisfaction that came from meeting difficult standards consistently. "I never realized how good it feels to be someone others can count on," he wrote. "When they put me in charge of vehicle maintenance for our unit, I was terrified I'd mess up and cause problems for everyone. But I didn't mess up. I worked harder than I've ever worked at anything, and now the vehicles run perfectly and everyone trusts me to keep them safe." Trust earned through competence and reliability, concepts that had been foreign to him in civilian life, but were becoming foundational to his military experience. The responsibility he'd avoided for years had become a source of pride rather than burden. His wife had also discovered the satisfaction of earned trust. Her colleagues relied on her judgment, her neighbors asked for her advice, and she'd begun volunteering with organizations that valued her newly developed organizational skills. The woman who'd once struggled to renew car registration was now coordinating community fundraisers and managing complex projects with apparent ease. "I don't know what I was so afraid of before," she confided during one of our rare but increasingly pleasant conversations. "I always thought I needed someone else to handle the complicated stuff, but most of it really isn't that complicated once you actually try to understand it." Fear and learned helplessness had been replaced by confidence and competence. The transformation was remarkable to witness, even from a distance. The broader family dynamics had shifted as well. Extended relatives who'd once automatically sided with my brother in any dispute now sought more complete information before choosing positions. His deployment had revealed the complexity of family relationships they'd previously understood in simple terms, and my role in facilitating his service had demonstrated both capability and resolve they hadn't expected. "We didn't realize how much you'd been handling on your own," my aunt said during a family gathering I attended while on leave. "With Tom away, it's become obvious how much work you were doing behind the scenes to keep everything running smoothly." The observation was accurate, but incomplete. I hadn't been working behind the scenes, I'd been working in plain sight while others chose not to notice or acknowledge my contributions. Still, recognition, however belated, represented progress toward more honest family relationships. My brother's deployment was scheduled to end in 6 months, and his letters had begun mentioning plans for his return. But the man preparing to come home bore little resemblance to the person who'd poured wine on my uniform 2 years earlier. Military service had fundamentally altered his character, replacing casual irresponsibility with earned competence and transforming his relationship with authority from resistance to respect. "I'm nervous about transitioning back to civilian life," he wrote in his most recent letter. "The structure here has become comfortable, and I've gotten used to knowing exactly what's expected of me and how to meet those expectations. I'm worried about falling back into old patterns when I don't have that structure anymore." The worry was legitimate and showed self-awareness that had been absent from his previous communications. Military service had taught him to value the very qualities, discipline, reliability, accountability, he'd once mocked in others. More importantly, it had taught him to recognize when those qualities were absent and to understand the problems their absence created. His wife had also expressed concerns about the transition, though hers focused on maintaining the independence and confidence she'd developed during his absence. She'd grown accustomed to making decisions, handling emergencies, and managing their life without consultation or assistance. The prospect of returning to previous patterns of dependence held little appeal for either of them. "I want us to be partners when he comes back," she told me during one conversation. "Not me relying on him for everything or him expecting me to handle all the details while he focuses on other things. We both know more about ourselves now than we did before." Partnership rather than dependence, a concept that had been foreign to their relationship but was now emerging as a realistic possibility based on mutual confidence and respect. Even Dad seemed to be preparing for a different kind of relationship with his returning son. The easy laughter that had once greeted my brother's irresponsibility had been replaced by cautious respect for the discipline and achievement his letters described. More significantly, Dad's interactions with me had become more substantive and appreciative as he'd observed the long-term effects of military training on character development. "I owe you an apology," he said during a phone call that caught me off guard with its seriousness. "I spent years thinking your military service was somehow holding you back from a normal life, but I was wrong. It was preparing you for a better life than most people manage to build." The apology was unexpected and surprisingly meaningful. It represented acknowledgement not just of his previous errors in judgment, but of the value I'd derived from choices he'd once considered questionable. From my perspective, the entire situation had evolved exactly as I'd hoped when I'd made that single phone call on Christmas night. Justice had been served through education rather than punishment, and relationships had been rebalanced through experience rather than confrontation. My brother had learned lessons about service and sacrifice that no amount of conversation could have conveyed, and his wife had discovered capabilities that years of encouragement might never have revealed. Most importantly, the casual disrespect that had characterized our family dynamic for so many years had been replaced by genuine appreciation for the qualities that military service develops and rewards. The uniform that had once been mocked was now understood as a symbol of earned competence and voluntary sacrifice. The wine stain was long gone, but its effects would prove permanent. My family had learned the difference between loyalty and enabling, between love and exploitation, between service and servitude. These lessons would shape our relationships for the remainder of our lives, creating a foundation of mutual respect that had been absent for far too long. When my brother returned from his deployment, he would find a family that had been transformed by his absence, not damaged or diminished, but strengthened and clarified. He would also find himself fundamentally changed by experiences that had taught him the value of everything he'd once dismissed or taken for granted. The revenge I'd taken hadn't been about hurting him, it had been about helping him become the person he'd always had the potential to be. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to discover their own strength, even when that discovery comes through difficulty they wouldn't have chosen for themselves. The uniform he'd mocked had become his salvation. The discipline he'd ridiculed had become his foundation. The service he'd dismissed had become his source of pride and competence. And the sister he'd humiliated had become the architect of his transformation from spoiled child to capable adult. The balance of our relationship would never again favor casual cruelty over mutual respect. That much, at least, had been permanently established. Years passed. My brother completed his deployment and transitioned back to civilian life with skills, discipline, and perspective that transformed his professional prospects and personal relationships. The man who returned bore little resemblance to the one who'd left, except in appearance and shared history. He found employment with a defense contractor, where his military experience and proven reliability opened doors that had been closed to him previously. His work performance, previously characterized by inconsistency and casual effort, became a source of professional pride and steady advancement. More importantly, he approached civilian responsibilities with the same methodical competence that military service had demanded and developed. His marriage, strengthened by their separate growth during his absence, evolved into the genuine partnership his wife had hoped for. They made decisions together, shared responsibilities equally, and supported each other's individual achievements without competition or resentment. The relationship had been forced to mature through separation and challenge, emerging stronger and more respectful than it had been when built on mutual dependence and avoidance. Dad's perspective on both military service and family dynamics continued to evolve as he observed the long-term effects of my brother's deployment. The casual dismissal of military discipline that had characterized his previous attitudes was replaced by genuine appreciation for the character development and practical skills that service provided. More significantly, He began to understand how his own favoritism and inconsistent expectations had damaged family relationships and individual growth. "I think I did you both a disservice over the years," he told me during a visit that coincided with my brother's return. "I made things too easy for him and expected too much from you, without realizing that both approaches were harmful in their own ways." The admission represented years of reflection and uncomfortable self-examination. It also represented the foundation for healthier family relationships based on realistic expectations and mutual respect rather than inherited roles and unexamined assumptions. My own career had continued its upward trajectory, with promotions and recognitions that reflected both competence and character developed through years of service and sacrifice. The qualities that had once seemed excessive to my family, discipline, reliability, commitment to excellence, were now understood as the foundation of meaningful achievement and personal integrity. The respect I received from colleagues and superiors stood in stark contrast to the casual dismissal I'd once accepted from family members, highlighting how drastically our dynamics had shifted over the years since that Christmas Eve confrontation. My brother and I began meeting occasionally for lunch or coffee, conversations that were initially tentative but gradually became more substantive and honest. He never explicitly apologized for years of disrespect and exploitation, but his changed behavior and obvious effort to treat me as an equal rather than a resource served as ongoing acknowledgement of past mistakes. "I understand now why you always seemed so serious about everything," he said during one of these meetings. "When other people are counting on you to get things right, you can't afford to be casual about your responsibilities." I spent years thinking that was uptight, but it was actually mature. Maturity, a quality he developed through forced experience with real consequences rather than the theoretical discussions that had proven ineffective for so many years. The transformation was genuine and apparently permanent, built on foundations of earned competence rather than inherited privilege. His wife had also continued to flourish independently, building a career and social network based on her own capabilities rather than reflected status. She'd become someone whose opinions were sought and valued, whose presence was appreciated rather than simply tolerated, and whose contributions were recognized rather than taken for granted. "I owe you a debt I can never really repay," she told me during a family gathering celebrating my latest promotion. "If you hadn't done what you did, I'd probably still be waiting for someone else to handle everything complicated in my life." The gratitude was sincere and touching, though unnecessary. Her growth had been the result of her own effort and courage, not my intervention. I'd simply removed the barriers that had prevented her natural capabilities from emerging and developing. The broader family had also adjusted to new realities and expectations. Extended relatives who'd once assumed I would handle any crisis or obligation now approached family responsibilities with more equitable distribution of effort and accountability. The automatic assumption that my availability and competence made me the designated problem solver had been replaced by more realistic expectations and shared responsibilities. Family gatherings became genuinely pleasant rather than exercises in managed resentment. Conversations included all participants as equals rather than featuring some members while utilizing others as supporting cast. Most importantly, my presence was valued for its own sake rather than simply for the practical support it provided during difficult times. During one such gathering, I found myself observing the transformed dynamics with quiet satisfaction. My brother helped with preparations without being asked. His wife contributed thoughtfully to conversations rather than simply providing appreciative audience, and Dad treated everyone's achievements and opinions with equal interest and respect. The Christmas Eve uniform incident had become family legend, discussed occasionally with mixture of embarrassment and acknowledgement of its transformative effects. No one pretended it had been pleasant, but everyone recognized it as the catalyst for necessary changes that had improved all of their lives substantially. "I can't believe I was ever that stupid," my brother said during one such discussion, shaking his head at the memory. "But I'm grateful you didn't let me stay that way." Gratitude for difficult lessons imposed without consent, an attitude that demonstrated how completely his perspective had shifted from entitlement to appreciation, from victim mentality to personal responsibility. Looking back across the years that had passed since that night of wine and humiliation, I could see the clear trajectory from crisis to resolution, from dysfunction to health, from exploitation to mutual respect. The intervention I'd chosen had been dramatic and irreversible, but it had also been precisely calibrated to address the specific problems that needed correction. My brother had needed to learn about service, sacrifice, and the satisfaction that comes from meeting high standards consistently. His wife had needed to discover her own competence and independence. Dad had needed to confront the long-term effects of favoritism and inconsistent expectations. The family as a whole had needed to develop more equitable and respectful relationships. Military deployment had provided the perfect vehicle for delivering all these lessons simultaneously, creating circumstances that made growth necessary rather than optional, and ensuring that changes would be permanent rather than temporary. The uniform that had been stained with wine now hung in my closet among others, each representing years of service, sacrifice, and achievement that had shaped both my character and my family's understanding of what such service actually required and provided. Justice, I'd learned, doesn't always roar with dramatic confrontation and immediate consequences. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through carefully chosen actions that create inevitable outcomes over extended periods. Sometimes it works through education rather than punishment, through opportunity rather than deprivation, through challenge rather than comfort. The wine had been cleaned from my uniform, but its effects had proven indelible. My family had been transformed by understanding what they'd previously dismissed, and I'd been vindicated by time and outcome rather than argument and explanation. Most importantly, we'd all learned that respect, once lost, must be earned back through changed behavior rather than good intentions, and that family loyalty requires reciprocity rather than exploitation to remain sustainable and healthy. The balance had been restored, permanently and properly. That was justice enough. But life, as I'd learned through years of military service, rarely allows for neat conclusions or permanent resolutions. New challenges emerge, relationships continue to evolve, and the lessons we think we've mastered reveal additional layers of complexity that require fresh understanding and adaptation. 5 years after my brother's return from deployment, our family faced a crisis that would test whether the changes we'd undergone were truly permanent or merely situational. Mom was diagnosed with early-onset dementia, a progressive condition that would require coordinated family support and difficult decisions about care, finances, and long-term planning. The old version of our family dynamics would have defaulted to familiar patterns. I would have shouldered primary responsibility, while others provided emotional support and occasional assistance. Dad would have deferred to my competence, while my brother contributed sporadic help between other commitments. The burden would have been mine because I was reliable, available, and accustomed to handling complicated situations alone. Instead, our first family meeting about Mom's diagnosis revealed how fundamentally our relationships had changed. My brother arrived with a detailed research folder about dementia care options, having spent weeks investigating local facilities, in-home care services, and financial planning strategies. His wife had coordinated with her employer to arrange flexible scheduling that would allow her to help with daily care needs. Dad had consulted with financial advisors and estate attorneys to ensure Mom's wishes would be honored and her resources properly managed. "I know this is going to be hard on all of us," my brother said as we sat around the kitchen table where so many difficult conversations had taken place over the years. "But I want you to know that Sarah and I are committed to sharing this responsibility equally. You shouldn't have to handle this alone just because you're the most organized." The statement represented a complete reversal of previous family dynamics. Instead of assuming my availability and competence made me the designated crisis manager, he was actively working to ensure equitable distribution of care responsibilities. The military discipline he developed had taught him to approach challenges systematically rather than reactively, and his wife's newfound confidence enabled her to contribute meaningfully rather than simply offering moral support. Dad's response was equally revealing. Rather than defaulting to my judgment and expecting me to coordinate everyone else's contributions, he took initiative in areas where his experience and resources were most valuable. He researched legal requirements for guardianship and healthcare decisions, interviewed financial advisors who specialized in long-term care planning, and began difficult conversations with Mom about her preferences for various scenarios. I've spent too many years letting others handle the hard stuff while I stayed comfortable on the sidelines, he told me during a private conversation. Your mother deserves better than that, and so do you. The acknowledgement meant more than he probably realized. It represented recognition not just of past failures, but of current responsibility to do better. The man who'd once laughed at my humiliation was now actively working to ensure I wouldn't be overwhelmed by our family's latest challenge. Managing Mom's care over the following months required constant coordination, difficult decisions, and emotional resilience that tested all of us in different ways. But the family that handled this crisis bore no resemblance to the one that had gathered for Christmas Eve dinner years earlier. Responsibilities were shared equitably, decisions were made collectively, and support was offered freely rather than extracted through guilt or manipulation. My brother's transformation proved especially remarkable during this period. The man who'd once avoided uncomfortable conversations and deferred responsibility to others became our family's most reliable advocate in dealing with healthcare providers, insurance companies, and care facilities. His military experience had taught him to navigate bureaucratic systems efficiently and to insist on appropriate service levels without accepting substandard treatment. I learned something important during my deployment, he told me after a particularly difficult meeting with Mom's care team. When someone you care about depends on you to get things right, you find strength and patience you didn't know you had. I spent years thinking that kind of responsibility was a burden, but it's actually a privilege. Privilege rather than burden, a perspective that represented complete reversal of his previous attitudes toward family obligations. The deployment that had been intended as education had become genuine transformation, creating lasting changes in character rather than temporary compliance with external requirements. His wife's continued growth was equally impressive. She'd become our family's emotional anchor during medical appointments and care discussions, providing comfort and practical support with competence that surprised everyone, including herself. The woman who'd once struggled with basic household management was now coordinating complex care schedules and advocating effectively for Mom's needs in medical settings. The experience of caring for Mom together also revealed how much Dad had changed since my brother's deployment. Instead of maintaining his previous pattern of emotional distance, punctuated by occasional jokes or comments, he became actively engaged in day-to-day care decisions and practical support. He spent hours each day with Mom, patiently helping with activities that her declining cognitive function made increasingly difficult. I wasted too many years taking your mother for granted, he confided during one of these sessions. I always assumed she'd be there to handle the details while I focused on bigger picture stuff. Now that she needs me to handle the details, I'm grateful for every opportunity to take care of her properly. The role reversal was profound and touching. The man who'd once expected others to manage complications was now embracing complexity as an expression of love and commitment rather than an inconvenience to be avoided. As Mom's condition progressed, our family developed systems and rhythms that maximized her comfort while distributing care responsibilities in ways that acknowledged everyone's strengths and limitations. My military training proved valuable for logistical coordination and crisis management, but it was no longer the only source of competence and reliability within our family structure. My brother's deployment experience had taught him patience, attention to detail, and the importance of following protocols consistently. His wife's forced independence had developed her confidence and problem-solving abilities. Dad's belated recognition of his previous shortcomings had motivated genuine effort to contribute meaningfully rather than symbolically. The crisis that might once have destroyed our family relationships instead strengthened them by providing opportunities for everyone to demonstrate growth and commitment. We learned to rely on each other without exploitation, to share responsibilities without resentment, and to support each other through difficulty without martyrdom or manipulation. More importantly, we discovered that the lessons learned through my brother's deployment had created permanent changes in our family's character rather than temporary adjustments to immediate circumstances. The discipline, mutual respect, and shared responsibility that had emerged from that crisis continued to serve us well when faced with new challenges that required sustained cooperation and emotional maturity. Mom's care became a shared mission that brought out the best in everyone involved, proving that the transformation that had begun with wine and humiliation on Christmas Eve had indeed been genuine and lasting. The family that had once operated on exploitation and favoritism had become one that functioned through mutual support and equitable contribution. The uniform that had been stained years earlier remained a symbol of service and sacrifice, but it was no longer the only symbol of those qualities within our family. My brother wore his own metaphorical uniform now, the discipline and responsibility he'd learned through deployment and had chosen to maintain in civilian life. His wife wore hers in the form of confidence and competence she'd developed through necessity and had continued to cultivate through choice. Even Dad had found his own version of service through his commitment to caring for Mom with patience and dedication that honored their decades of marriage and acknowledged his gratitude for her years of managing details he'd previously ignored. Justice, I realized, wasn't just about correcting past wrongs or balancing scales that had been tilted unfairly. It was about creating conditions that allowed people to become their best selves rather than their most convenient selves, and about building relationships based on mutual respect rather than inherited assumptions. The wine had been cleaned from my uniform long ago, but its stain had marked the beginning of a transformation that continued to unfold in ways I couldn't have anticipated and wouldn't have dared to hope for when I'd made that single phone call on Christmas night. That Christmas Eve changed everything. For once, I stopped absorbing the disrespect and showed my family what real accountability looks like. What about you? Have you ever had to draw the line with family? Did standing up for yourself bring distance, or did it finally earn you respect? Drop your story in the comments, I read them all. And if you want more true stories about boundaries, justice, and self-worth, make sure to like this video and subscribe.